Greetings, John here with another look at Rise of the Tomb Raider. This time we have the PC version of the game in-house courtesy of the always reliable Nixes. Released less than 3 months ago on Xbox One and Xbox 360, this new installment in the Tomb Raider series brings some truly remarkable visuals and technology to the table. Beautifully detailed landscapes are combined with some of the best real-time cutscenes we've ever seen. And the Xbox One version is already a fantastic looking game, but thanks to a few rough edges, there is definitely some room for improvement, and that's exactly what you'll get with the PC version. If you have the hardware, expect image quality improvements, faster frame rates, and extra details throughout the experience. But before you start cranking up settings to the max, take note that Rise of the Tomb Raider is significantly more demanding than its prequel, and there are certain settings which can have a dramatic impact on performance. We'll dive into those settings shortly, but before that, let's jump right in and see how the PC version stacks up against the Xbox One original. For this comparison, I'm running the game with the very high preset at 1080p. In order to keep the frame rate consistent on this aging GTX 780 that I'm using here, I have elected to cap the frame rate at 30 frames per second for this segment. With that said, let's get started. First impressions suggest a very similar presentation, but there are plenty of improvements to be found if you look closely. Let's pause for a moment here and look at the shadows. So why do the shadows on Xbox One appear sharper here, you might be asking? Well, it's simple. In the settings menu, Nixes has added an option for Sun Soft Shadows, which takes into account the distance of shadows cast by the sun from the objects casting them. Moving on, we see another improvement right here as Lara passes through this foliage. Note how it reacts to Lara as she passes through it. This is the dynamic foliage setting in action. While plenty of branches are already reactive on Xbox One, this additional setting on PC enables even more reactive foliage throughout the game. A nice touch indeed. While running through these sections, be sure to look closely at the contact shadows throughout the world. While Xbox One makes use of a custom ambient obscurance technique, the PC version enjoys the benefits of my favorite ambient occlusion technique, HBAO+. Another interesting detail here, the stump shadow fades in at exactly the same point on both versions of the game. And this is on very high, I must remind you. Pausing for a second, you can see the benefits of the improved shadows on PC right here. Moving on, let's run through the village here, where we once again see a very similar presentation. Pop-in occurs in exactly the same moment here in the distance, interestingly enough, but around the corner we see extra detail drawing in on Xbox One that is already present on the PC. So the question at this point is, do the settings used on Xbox One line up with any of the PC presets? Simply put, no. Based on our comparisons, the Xbox One version falls around the high settings, but it's not so cut and dry. Take for instance this scene. While object detail is comparable to the high and very high settings, in fact, there are noticeable differences to be found. Ground tessellation is absent on Xbox One, for instance. Soft sun shadows are disabled, anisotropic filtering is reduced to very low levels, and of course HBAO+ is not in use here. All of these settings are enabled at the high and very high presets, but they are not present on Xbox One. You can really see the difference between HBAO+ and the solution used on Xbox One here. Texture detail, however, is actually consistent with the highest PC setting. Of course, all of the other details, such as motion blur, bloom, vignette blur, hair physics, screen effects, lens flare, and screen space reflections are enabled on Xbox One, which is consistent with the high setting on PC. Depth of field is also a match for the highest PC setting, while scene level of detail is comparable as well. Ultimately, the Xbox One version operates with many of the details enabled or at high settings, while more advanced PC features are of course absent. So just what does the PC settings menu offer to players then? Well, let's take a look. Let's begin with the display settings. Beneath this header we have the typical assortment of PC-specific options, including resolution, refresh rate, anti-aliasing, and vertical sync type. Under anti-aliasing, we actually have 2 levels of super sampling available, which is quite nice if you have the hardware to power it. Though of course, if you're using an NVIDIA card, you can also engage NVIDIA's DSR along with exclusive full screen mode to push resolutions beyond that of your monitor's native resolution. Moving on to the graphics settings, we see a wealth of available options ripe for adjustment. Let's begin with the game's presets. Cycling through each of the 5 presets gives you an idea of what you can expect. The game manages to look quite nice at all but the lowest of settings. Of course, this is a PC game, so it should come as no surprise that individual settings can be adjusted manually as well. Let's go ahead and see how these settings impact image quality. We'll start with shadow quality. At the lowest setting, we actually see a complete lack of shadows, but as we push this detail up, shadow definition predictably improves greatly. It is fascinating to see how the lack of shadows impact indoor locations as well. Then we have the tessellation setting. We've already noted that Xbox One only makes limited use of this feature, but in the PC version, we see tessellation expanded across many areas of the world. You can see how this impacts the quality of the terrain here. It really brings a lot of extra depth to the presentation. There are also a number of options which can be toggled on and off, such as bloom here, or screen space reflections here. And in most cases, these settings seem to have a minimal impact on performance. We've already discussed the inclusion of HBAO+, but there are 2 other options available, the standard AO, and of course no AO at all. Next we have texture detail, which shows a pretty significant difference between the low and very high texture settings. The GTX 780 that I'm using here only includes 3GB of VRAM, and pushing textures beyond the high setting definitely has a noticeable impact on performance, with additional stuttering and hitching. Lastly, let's take a look at the detail settings in action. As the setting is increased, we see a greater density of objects in the distance, just as you'd expect. Ultimately, what we have here is another example of a high-quality Nix's PC port. Rise of the Tomb Raider is a beautiful yet tweakable game. Thanks to a wealth of adjustable options, it's possible to enjoy the game on a wide variety of hardware. Yet there is still enough here to grow as more powerful PC components become available. Performance was excellent on my PC, despite an aging GPU that isn't well suited for tasks reliant on asynchronous compute. While assembling this video, we did not yet have access to the NVIDIA Game Ready driver. Yet, even at this point, the performance was already stable and the game works well without any notable issues. A PC game that works this well, even prior to release, is always something that deserves praise. Beyond that, Rise of the Tomb Raider is just a great game that's well worth playing. Whether on the PC, the Xbox One, or even the 360, it's one of the best action-adventure titles of the last year. So that about wraps things up here. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out the rest of our coverage of Rise of the Tomb Raider over on YouTube, where we dive further into the technology behind the game and compare the Xbox One and Xbox 360 versions. And until next time, this is John, signing off.